They thought they could hurt you and walk away without consequence. No apology, no acknowledgement, just silence. But here's what they never expected. You didn't need closure. You needed clarity. And once you found it, everything changed. You didn't seek revenge. You didn't try to prove a point. Instead, you rose, in silence, in peace, and in that quiet, you became untouchable. Because real power doesn't shout. It doesn't chase. It simply grows. And the more you grew, the more they were left to sit with the echo of what they did. The same people who once dismissed your pain now feel the absence of your forgiveness, something they once assumed would always be freely given. But you've changed. This time, you don't need their apology to be free. You've already freed yourself. This is the shift. You stop chasing peace, and you become it. Here's a truth many resist. People who hurt you often know what they did. It's not forgetfulness, it's avoidance. Because facing the harm means facing themselves. And that takes a level of self-awareness many simply don't have. A genuine apology requires more than just words. It demands emotional responsibility, the courage to look beyond image, and truly see the damage caused. But when someone operates from ego instead of accountability, even saying "I'm sorry" can feel threatening. Because to apologize is to admit they were wrong, that they're not as good or as innocent as they pretend to be. So instead, they minimize your pain, rewrite the story, or disappear completely. But no matter how much they run, they can't outrun their own reflection. That's the quiet paradox. The more grounded your silence, the louder it echoes in their mind. Not because you lashed out, but because you didn't. You didn't beg. You didn't argue. You didn't need their version of closure to begin healing. That's the version of you they never prepared for. They expected anger, maybe chaos, but calm. That unsettled them because it meant you were no longer in their control. This is where Stoicism cuts deeper than revenge ever could. The Stoics remind us, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. So imagine their suffering now, caught in the silence you left behind. Not because you wish them harm, but because you chose peace, because you chose you. That's when they start replaying old conversations, rereading old messages, revisiting the moment they crossed the line, and realizing there's no way back. Because you didn't just walk away, you evolved. The truth, they're not avoiding an apology because they don't understand what they did. They're avoiding it because they know they lost access to you, emotionally, spiritually, permanently. And no apology, no matter how sincere, can restore that. It's not just your forgiveness they miss, it's your presence, your patience, the grace you offered without question. They didn't just lose you, they lost the best version of themselves, the one only reflected through your eyes. Final thought. The absence of an apology doesn't mean your pain isn't real. It simply means they weren't strong enough to face what they caused. But that's no longer your weight to carry. The moment you stop waiting for them to fix what they broke is the moment you begin building something they can never reach. Your inner peace, your clarity, your quiet power. And that, more than anything, is what unsettles the guilty. Knowing that the person they hurt has not only healed, but healed without them. We're often taught that closure is necessary, that we can't move on until we get it. But the truth is, closure isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's a decision, because waiting for someone to explain why they hurt you, when they either can't or won't, is not healing. It's hoping, and misplaced hope becomes a prison. Let's be honest. The person who ghosted you, betrayed you, disrespected you, most likely won't have that final conversation. Not because they don't know your pain, but because they can't face what it reveals about them. This isn't always narcissism. Sometimes it's just fear. But the result is the same. you're left in emotional limbo. That's why people stay stuck. They wait for the apology that never comes, the explanation that finally makes it all make sense. But what if that apology never comes? What if healing isn't about waiting, but about releasing the need for their validation? This is emotional maturity. You don't need someone to say, "I hurt you," to know that you were hurt. You don't need their remorse to make your experience real. You don't need to understand why, because sometimes they don't even understand themselves. And that's okay, because your peace no longer depends on their accountability. It depends on your choice to reclaim yourself. And in that choice, you win. You don't need closure from them, because the moment you choose to close the door yourself, you create freedom. That's not bitterness. That's a boundary. That's the moment you shift from wounded to wise. The Stoics had a word for this kind of freedom. They taught that it's not the events themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Epictetus said that. Silence by itself is neutral. It's our mind that gives it weight, interpreting it as rejection, punishment, or abandonment. But silence is just silence. And this is where the Stoic path begins. You learn to separate fact from fiction. Fact, they hurt you. Fact, they never apologized. Fact, you survived. Fiction, you need their explanation to move forward. That's not healing. That's hesitation. That's giving your power to the same person who once misused it. And here's the irony. The longer you chase closure, the more you delay your own peace. Because healing doesn't begin when they say, "I'm sorry." It begins when you say, "I don't need to carry this anymore." That's not detachment. It's self-respect. It's what emotional maturity looks like. Choosing peace over explanation. Choosing clarity over chaos. And something strange happens when you do this. The silence they use to avoid accountability becomes the very thing that now confronts them. Because your silence carries weight. Your absence speaks. And what they once took for granted becomes something they can no longer reach. Here's the truth. Closure isn't a conversation. It's a decision. A quiet, internal line you draw. Not to keep them out, but to keep your peace in. So the next time your mind starts replaying what they never said, pause and ask yourself gently, why am I giving this much power to someone who couldn't even give me honesty? You don't need their words to heal. You just need to stop waiting for them. Because when you stop needing closure, you start walking in freedom. And that kind of freedom, they'll never understand. Now let's talk about a trap that often disguises itself as strength. The obsession with justice. It's natural. When someone wrongs you, you want balance. You want them to own what they did. You want the universe to make it right. But here's what most people won't say out loud. The more you chase justice from the very people who caused the harm, the more control you give back to them. They may have lied. They may have walked away without a word. And now a part of you is still hoping the story will be rewritten, that they'll return, admit everything, and finally say, "You were right. I was wrong." That kind of justice feels noble, but often it's a fantasy, a beautiful one, but still a fantasy. And holding on to that vision, it quietly drains the strength you're trying to rebuild. Because in emotional pain, there's no courtroom, no judge, no jury, no final statement. There's just you and the choice to stop looking backward. True justice is not about watching them fall. It's about watching yourself rise. So the next chapter isn't about waiting for an apology or a reckoning. It's about reclaiming your story, not because they made it right, but because you finally decided to stop letting them write the ending. There's a pain deeper than betrayal, and it's the quiet realization that those who hurt you may never be held accountable. Not by you, not by others, maybe not by anyone. And that's where many people stay stuck, waiting, hoping, watching, until their life becomes a reaction to someone else's actions. But what if real power isn't found in retaliation, but in release? The moment you stop trying to get even, you begin to see clearly. The moment you stop needing their apology, you begin to feel peace. And the moment you stop chasing justice, you begin to reclaim your own mind. That's where healing begins. Because now, your decisions are no longer shaped by old pain. You're no longer living in the story of maybe one day they'll regret it. You're living in the story of you. Because justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it's silent. Sometimes it looks like quietly walking away and never turning around. Sometimes it's building a life so grounded, their absence becomes irrelevant. That's what the Stoics understood. They didn't wait for fairness from the world. They didn't wait for apologies. They trained themselves to govern the only thing they could truly control: their response. The best revenge is not to be like your enemy, Marcus Aurelius. That doesn't mean you excuse what happened. It means you no longer carry the burden of proving it to anyone. That's emotional intelligence at its highest level. You don't need punishment. You need peace. And peace begins when you say, "I'm done pouring energy into what I didn't break." This is what reclaiming your power looks like. You stop checking their social media. You stop writing invisible conversations in your mind. You stop wondering if they miss you or if they regret it. You stop using their silence to measure your worth. And above all, you stop reacting. Not because you've gone numb, but because you finally understand your energy is sacred. This is the heart of psychological boundaries. Not walls built from bitterness, but gates made from wisdom. Because true power was never in the hands of those who hurt you. It's in your ability to stop needing them to fix what they broke. Final reflection for this chapter. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you'll ever do is walk away without needing to be right. Let them rewrite the story. Let them pretend it never happened. Let them believe they got away with it. Because while they're still trying to outrun the truth, you're already building a life they'll never be strong enough to stand in. So stop chasing justice. Start choosing peace. Choose growth. Choose clarity. Choose purpose. That is your justice. That is your healing. And more than anything, that is your liberation. Let's talk about something deeply misunderstood: forgiveness. Many believe forgiveness means peace between you and the person who hurt you. A heartfelt conversation, a final message, maybe even a reunion. But that's not forgiveness. That's reconciliation. And not everyone earns that. Because real forgiveness, especially in the Stoic sense, has nothing to do with them. It has everything to do with you. Here's the shift. You always have the option of having no opinion. Marcus Aurelius. You don't need to hear their side. You don't need to understand why they did what they did. You don't need to wait for them to meet you where they never could. Forgiveness is not a transaction. It's a release, a conscious decision to stop drinking the poison. Even when the person who handed it to you never said sorry, that's the kind of peace they can't take away, because it was never dependent on them in the first place. The pain of waiting for closure. For many, the real pain doesn't come from what happened. It comes from what didn't happen after. No apology, no recognition, no resolution. So they hold on. Not to the event, but to the hope that one day it'll make sense. That one day someone will come back and explain it all. But forgiveness was never about making sense. It's about making space. Space in your mind, in your soul, and in your future. That's emotional intelligence at its highest level. Saying, I choose not to carry what was never mine to hold. You're not excusing what happened. You're not rewriting the past. You're simply saying, I'm done bleeding from a wound they never tried to heal. The Stoic approach to forgiveness. Forgive internally, not interpersonally. That's what the Stoics would say. You don't owe anyone a conversation, because the most important conversation is the one you have with yourself. What does that look like? You stop needing their explanation. You stop arguing with memories. You stop assigning meaning to their silence. You stop hoping for justice or longing for revenge. Instead, you begin asking deeper questions. What did this teach me about myself? What boundaries needed strengthening? What patterns must I stop repeating? How do I grow so this never happens again? That's not weakness, that's clarity. Forgiveness becomes a spiritual discipline. Not soft, not sentimental, but strong, clean, decisive. Like cutting a rope that's been dragging you underwater. The power of forgiveness. Without contact. Some people don't change when they hurt you. They change when they realize you've forgiven them. Silently, without confrontation, without drama, just disconnection. And that disconnection, it speaks louder than any argument ever could. It says, "You are no longer part of my inner world." Not from bitterness, but from freedom. Forgiveness without contact doesn't make you weak. It means you've simply run out of things to prove. Your peace speaks for itself. Your calm becomes your strength. And what they hoped would destroy you no longer even touches you. That's inner peace. That's psychological detachment. That's emotional mastery. Final reflection. You don't need to confront them. You don't need to unblock them. You don't need to revisit the story. Because the most powerful forgiveness is the one that expects nothing in return. The one that says, I choose peace, not because they're sorry, but because I'm finished suffering. That's the Stoic path. Not noisy revenge, but quiet elevation, clean separation, no closure needed. They didn't flinch when they caused the damage. They called you dramatic, too emotional, replaceable. But here's what they didn't expect. That your silence would echo louder than any confrontation. Because the day always comes. Not always soon, not always visibly. But it comes. The day they realize they lost someone irreplaceable. Not because you left in anger, but because you left in peace. And that peace becomes the mirror they can't escape. The weight of your absence. At first, they'll project, call you too sensitive, too much, too soft. But silence has a way of letting the truth in, slowly. Not as guilt, but as discomfort. Your absence begins to reflect what they couldn't face in themselves. Their immaturity, their emotional avoidance, their inability to hold something real. And suddenly your silence isn't empty. It's full of everything they failed to honor. Spiritual consequence and the Stoic view. The Stoics believed our choices shape not just what we experience, but who we become. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Marcus Aurelius. When they chose betrayal, control, or indifference, they weren't just hurting you. They were shaping the kind of person they would become. They chose comfort over courage, control over connection, ego over empathy. And now they live with that version of themselves. But you've grown, you've healed, you've moved forward. And that contrast burns more than any revenge ever could. The dignity that haunts them. Because what truly unsettles someone who expected you to stay is realizing you didn't chase, you didn't beg, you didn't explode. You left with dignity. And that dignity becomes their mirror. It reminds them they didn't lose you because you were weak. They lost you because you finally knew your worth. And nothing challenges the ego of an emotionally avoidant person more than being ignored by the very soul they assumed would always remain. It wasn't a game to you. It was love, loyalty, real presence, and they treated it like it was disposable. Now they crave what they can no longer touch. What you did right. Even if it hurt, You made the right choice. You stopped explaining. You stopped negotiating your value. You stopped chasing closure. You chose self-respect over temporary validation. You built boundaries they can't access. You walked into freedom. And now, they're left scrolling through old messages, watching your stories, listening for your name in rooms you no longer enter. Not because they want you back, but because they want to feel close to what they can no longer reach. That's not revenge. That's healing. And that's the kind of peace they'll never understand. The version of you that loved them unconditionally, even through confusion, even through pain. That version no longer exists. You've evolved, and some people only realize what they had after it's already gone. Final reflection. For Chapter 5, regret has a slow way of catching up, especially for those who, too late, come to understand that what they walked away from was exactly what they once claimed to want. But your role was never to make them feel that loss. Your role is simply to rise. Because in the end, the most powerful consequence for hurting someone good is watching that person thrive in a life they can no longer access. That's not revenge. That's reality. That's quiet redemption. A truth many avoid. You don't need to block someone on your phone if you've already disconnected from them in your soul. Becoming unreachable isn't about deleting numbers or moving cities. It's about becoming so grounded in your peace, so elevated in your mindset and self-worth, that even if they return, you're simply not available. Not emotionally, not energetically, not spiritually. Because the version of you that chased closure, overanalyzed silence, and begged for clarity doesn't live here anymore. And no, that's not bitterness. That's boundaries. Let's be clear. You're not cold. You're not cruel. You're just no longer open to chaos. The people who once hurt you, they weren't just careless. They were comfortable in your confusion. They stayed when your standards were low. They vanished the moment you asked for emotional depth. Now that you've rebuilt your standards, they don't recognize you anymore. And that's okay. It's not your burden to be recognizable to those who only understood your unhealed self. That's not rejection. That's growth. The real meaning of no contact through the Stoic lens. It's not a defense mechanism. It's not punishment. It's simply this: a refusal to shrink yourself just to be understood by someone who never tried to understand you. You stop checking your phone for messages. You stop rereading conversations hoping they'll make more sense. You stop leaving the door open just in case. You stop justifying the unjustifiable. This isn't cruelty. It's self-respect. It's emotional maturity. And here's the paradox. Even without saying a word, they feel the difference. You don't have to announce your growth. You don't need dramatic exits or cryptic captions. The shift happens quietly, within. You begin dressing for your future, not your past. You build habits that support your peace. You draw in people who reflect your growth, not your wounds. And suddenly, the silence they once used to control you, now it works against them. Because when you no longer need their presence, their apology, or their validation, you become unshakable. This is emotional intelligence in action. Not just understanding people, but choosing how to manage your energy around them. You become mindful of the spaces that trigger anxiety, doubt your intuition, or play games with your nervous system. And now, you listen to your body. Tension is no longer confused with connection. Uncertainty is no longer mistaken for chemistry. You honor your boundaries before your breaking points. That's what emotional clarity looks like. There comes a moment on your path when people from the past try to return. Not because they've changed, but because you have. They sense the peace. They notice the glow. They feel the distance. But what they don't realize is this: you've healed into someone they were never equipped to meet. They weren't built to walk beside this version of you. And that's not arrogance, it's alignment. You've become someone different now. Someone who walks in clarity, sets boundaries with grace, and no longer compromises their peace to make others comfortable. You're not cold. You're just no longer accessible to emotional chaos. Final reflection. For Chapter 6, being unreachable isn't about walls. It's about gates. Gates that stay open only for those who arrive with integrity, with honesty, emotional maturity, and depth. Once you've experienced true peace, you stop entertaining anything that disrupts it. And those who once hurt you, they may knock, they may linger, they may hope, but they'll never again gain access to the version of you they once took for granted. Not because you fought back, but because you stopped fighting at all. Let's talk about revenge. It's a tempting idea when your heart has been mishandled, to want them to feel what they made you feel. But the Stoics knew better. Marcus Aurelius said, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." In other words, you don't retaliate. You simply outgrow the story they tried to keep you trapped in. They expected your collapse. Instead, you rose. Quietly, calmly, completely. You stopped asking why. Stopped needing closure. Stopped chasing clarity from those who thrived in your confusion. Instead, you rebuilt. Not to prove anything, but because you finally remembered who you are. This is psychological karma. You didn't shout. You didn't expose them. You didn't play the victim. You simply disappeared from their drama and reappeared in your own life, with discipline, with peace, with purpose. You healed. You protected your energy. You began attracting better because you became better. And while they waited for your breakdown, you became someone they can no longer reach. What haunts them isn't your anger. It's your calm. It's your lack of reaction. It's that you're not trying to be heard anymore. This is not emptiness. This is evolution. Silence doesn't mean weakness. It means direction. It means conservation. It means power turned inward. The Stoics lived by this. They didn't waste words on ears that refused to listen. They let the weight of their example speak instead. And now, so do you. Your silence carries one message. I no longer respond to chaos. I've outgrown it. They expected drama. You gave them dignity. They expected collapse. You gave them composure. They expected war. You gave them nothing. And that nothing, that stillness, is the echo they never saw coming. Final reflection. For Chapter 7, they will remember what they said to you, not because you reminded them, but because your absence is holding up a mirror. And in that mirror, they don't see you. They see who they were when they lost you. But you're no longer waiting for apologies, explanations, or justice. You're not trying to understand them anymore. You're not replaying the past like a detective. You're living your peace. You're grounded in your healing. And peace, that quiet, steady presence, is the loudest sound in an empty room. Here's the truth the Stoics knew well. Closure is a myth when it comes from those who never valued your heart. Waiting for them to explain what happened is waiting for clarity from someone who benefited from your confusion. But you no longer need it, because you've closed the chapter yourself, not with rage, but with reflection, with calm, with self-respect. And that's how you win, not over them, but for yourself. You don't need their apology. What you really need is your own permission to walk away in peace. Waiting for closure is often just a quiet trap dressed up as hope. We tell ourselves, if I just understood why, maybe they'll realize what they did. Maybe they'll come back. But you don't need them to understand. What you need is to see them clearly, without excuses, without fantasy. Some people are emotionally irresponsible. Some are psychologically immature. Some avoid themselves so deeply, they'll avoid you too, especially when it matters. The people who ghosted you manipulated you, gaslit you, betrayed your trust. They weren't confused. They simply chose comfort over accountability, silence over honesty, avoidance over growth. Let's be honest. They knew what they were doing. They saw how it affected you. They just didn't care enough to stop. They didn't forget to reply. They didn't need time. They chose distance. They chose disorder. They chose to protect their ego, not your connection. And the truth is, you were never actually confused. You were just trying to interpret harmful behavior through the lens of your compassion. You kept translating chaos as complexity, but it was simply disrespect. Closure isn't something they give you. It's something you decide. You decide, I saw the truth, and that's enough. I love deeply, and that's not weakness. I won't let someone's inability to care define my capacity to feel. You don't need one more message. You don't need the apology that's not coming. You don't need to explain your pain to someone who was never willing to understand it. What you need now is spiritual discipline, the kind that lets you release the need for validation from someone who once invalidated your entire experience. That's how you reclaim your power. Clarity is greater than closure. Because clarity, while painful, wakes you up. It breaks the illusion. It ends the hope that they'll become who you needed them to be. But once you accept that truth, you begin to rest. You stop checking the phone. You stop performing emotional CPR on a bond that never revived you. And you start creating space for peace, for healing, for something real. Clarity rebuilds your identity. It reminds you of your worth. It helps you walk forward with strength, not with a heart half broken. Because the moment you stop waiting for them to fix it, you begin fixing yourself. And nothing is more powerful than choosing growth over another cycle of pain. Final reflection. For Chapter 8. Closure is something emotionally evolved people offer one another. Not manipulators, not avoiders, not those who run from their own reflection. So stop expecting gold from a well that's always been dry. You don't need their words. You need your own truth. You need your next chapter. And it begins not when you ask, why did they leave? But when you ask, why did I ever accept so little? They were sure you'd stay, sure you'd return, sure that no matter what they did, the coldness, the lies, the manipulation, you'd always come back. And for a while, maybe you did. Not because you were weak, but because you were loyal, because your heart was steady. They mistook your patience for dependence. They mistook your empathy for passivity. They mistook your silence for surrender. But it wasn't, because the more you grew, the more you saw the truth. You were feeding a bond that was starving your spirit. And when you finally left, quietly, without drama or explanation, you didn't just walk away from them. You walked away from the version of you that tolerated the bare minimum. You removed the illusion of control. You released the weight of being ignored by the very person you held with care. Here's the paradox that stays with them. You were the safest space they had, and they polluted it. You were the one who would have stayed, and they pushed you away. But you're not stuck in that story anymore. You've turned the page, and what's ahead is a life that finally reflects what you've always deserved. You were the one who truly saw them. And still, somehow, they made you feel invisible. Now your absence isn't just silence. It's a mirror, a quiet reflection of everything they lost and can never regain. Because no one else texts with your sincerity. No one waits with your patience. No one sees through their wounds with the same depth. You were rare, and they treated you like you were replaceable. Now they're surrounded by noise. But it's your quiet presence they miss the most, even if they'll never admit it. They once believed they could reset the cycle. Hurt you, disappear, wait, return, be forgiven. But this time, Something shifted. Not just in the relationship, in you. You woke up. You stopped chasing. You stopped explaining. You stopped needing closure. And in that quiet choice, their reality changed. Now their messages go unanswered. Their familiar games fall flat. The charm no longer lands, because the person who once craved their attention no longer exists. This is what happens when you mishandle someone with a genuine heart. People think heartbreak is loud, but the deepest regret, it settles in the silence. Long after the chaos fades, long after they've moved on, long after they meet others who don't look them in the eye the way you once did, that's when it hits. Like a ghost. They scroll past your name. They see you glowing. And they wonder, how did they move on? But somewhere deep down, they already know. They lost something irreplaceable, and it was their doing. Final reflection. For Chapter 9, they assumed you'd never leave, because your grace was steady. But grace without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. Now you've become a quiet presence in their conscience. Not because you haunt them, but because their guilt does. They will remember your kindness, replay your loyalty, crave the peace they once misunderstood. But you're not watching anymore. You're not waiting. You're moving forward. With emotional intelligence, with spiritual clarity, with quiet power. Your absence now speaks louder than your presence ever did. You didn't just heal, you evolved. And here's what no one tells them. You didn't move on to become stronger. You moved on because you outgrew the version of yourself that tolerated less than you deserved. You stopped arguing, stopped proving, stopped offering access to people who never earned your presence. And in doing so, something powerful happened. You became someone they no longer have the privilege to reach. Because you're not the same. They remember the version of you who responded instantly, who gave second, third, and fourth chances. But that version of you has grown, has risen, and she's not coming back. You once believed the apologies, even when the actions didn't match the words. You showed up, even when it hurt. But that version of you is gone, and they can feel it. Now when they reach out, they're met with silence. When they test the waters, they find you standing, not waiting. You're not in pain anymore. You're in peace. They assumed time would soften your boundaries. But time didn't make you weaker. It made you wiser. Because your healing wasn't passive. It was intentional. You rebuilt yourself from the inside out. This new version of you doesn't react, doesn't explain, doesn't fear being misunderstood, because you're not living for their understanding anymore. You're living in alignment, with clarity, with self-respect, with quiet confidence. You no longer take betrayal personally, because it never was. It was never about your worth. It was a reflection of their capacity. You no longer absorb disrespect. You recognize it calmly and move on. That's emotional maturity, responding with intention, detaching with discipline, growing quietly without needing to be seen. Now you've become emotionally untouchable, not because you built walls, but because you built standards. They don't know how to reach you anymore, because the version they knew, the one who tolerated, explained, forgave endlessly, doesn't exist anymore. You no longer seek validation. You don't explain your peace. You guard it. And that's what truly unsettles them. Not your anger, but your absence. Not your reaction, but your quiet refusal to be pulled back in. They're on the outside now, watching you thrive, watching you smile again, watching you become unreachable. What they lost wasn't just a relationship. They lost someone real, someone who cared deeply, who saw them clearly, who stayed when it was hard. And now they're surrounded by people who only scratch the surface. No one listens the way you did. No one brings calm the way you did. No one mirrors truth the way you did, because people like you don't come around twice. Final reflection. For Chapter 10, you are no longer the version of yourself they discarded. You are no longer the safe space for their chaos, no longer the cushion for their recklessness. You have changed. You have risen. You are rooted now, in peace, in discernment, in strength. Yes, they may miss you. They may regret. They may ask for forgiveness. But you've learned. Forgiveness is a gift you can give. Access is a boundary you can keep. They thought the story ended when they hurt you. But it didn't end there. It began there. They didn't break you. They revealed the version of you who would never need to be broken again. You don't chase. You don't plead. You don't wait. You rise. You protect your peace. And you keep walking forward, quietly, confidently. Your silence doesn't scream. It speaks. It speaks of growth, of healing, of power. And for them, that silence is the loudest truth they'll ever hear. They lost the blessing. They created the distance. Let them sit with it. You're not angry. You're not bitter. You're just gone. If this reflection resonates with your soul, let us know in the comments. I forgive, but I no longer offer access. And if you're walking this path of grounded healing, subscribe to Stoic Mindset Mastery. Where silence is strength, wisdom is armor, and your comeback is already unfolding.